So today we're going to talk about developing a responsive website, but only one very specific part of it. It's probably the most difficult thing to understand when you're actually developing a responsive website, in fact, and it's flexible grids. It's confusing, to be honest. It's one of the most difficult bits to understand, and people generally don't know where to start with it because it's so alien as a concept from building other parts of websites, really. So we're going to take a look at it in this short video. So when it comes to a responsive website, the final core component of one is actually a flexible grid. And a flexible grid gives you the structure of the website. It's the building blocks of everything else. And it allows you to kind of quickly and easily lay out a website and make it look like your design more than anything else. That's the whole point of this thing. You want it to make it look like your design. But first, we're just going to look for about 2 minutes, we're going to look at the core elements of most websites, and I've made you a handy little diagram here that kind of explains it all. These are the elements of most websites, and yes, websites are the same these days, and they're all kind of boring. These are the main core elements. We're always going to have some kind of header to a website usually. We've got some kind of body section. We've got some kind of footer section. These are usually the main elements of a website, and inside the header we've got a logo and a navigation, we've got a content and some kind of sidebar content, and in the footer sometimes we've got copyright and then maybe some social links or something. The point I'm trying to get at with showing you this grid here and this layout is that when we're creating our designs and when we're actually building our designs, we usually need to figure out a way to kind of make things go next to each other, and that's the thing that people kind of struggle with when they're building websites. They struggle to make one thing go there and then one thing go there, and using a grid and using these kind of layout methodologies that I'm going to show you in this video is the ways to achieve it. So when we lay out a website, over the years the web design community have kind of created many different inventive ways of figuring out how to lay websites out and create complex layouts. When CSS wasn't really that good, we started with something called the table tag, the thing that you've probably never even seen. If today is one of the first times that you've built a website, or you're only just getting into building websites, you'll have never seen a website built with a table. But trust me, they were terrible. You never want to return to the place where we started with this kind of thing, which was building websites with tables. It's important to remember, though, that there's many ways now to achieve laying out complex designs. There's not just a one-size-fits-all solution. The method that I'm going to show you here, which is using a grid that is pre-written, I think is the best way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. There's these other ways as well that we need to talk about first, just for you to understand. So as I said, we've got tables, they're outdated and no longer used. The old, most popular one was actually floats. It was the original CSS only layout method, and it's probably the most reliable. It's the one that's going to work in any single browser that you even want to try that's been released in the last 15 years. So if your website needs to work in IE6 or something like that, floats is going to be the thing that you want to use. Then we've got Flex and we've got CSS Grid and things like that. Now they are the cutting edge, the most modern ways of achieving this kind of thing. And they're kind of cool and they're very, very easy to use. And most grids these days, Bootstrap and things like that, are built on either Flex or they're built on CSS Grid. The one that we're going to be looking at today is built on Flex. These are the most recent methods, and dare I say it, there's going to be other things that's going to come out as well that's going to go over the top of these and make these out of date as well. So yeah, but the thing that we're going to look at is pre-written grids. But just before we get to those, this link here, and I'm going to give you these slides too so you can check out these links. If you want to check out something about why table layouts are absurd and because it's a thing that you've probably never done before, go check out this link. So we're going to start with CSS floats. Now the structure of writing CSS floats in your CSS is actually pretty straightforward. It's just these three things that you need. You just need a main content of some type, and in our diagram that I showed before, that'd be the one on the left. You'd probably float that left and give it a width, and then you've got the sidebar which you'd float right and also give it a width, and then you've got some kind of clear fix. The clear fix thing, again, there's many ways to achieve clear fixes in CSS as well, which is another thing that I'm not going to get into in this video. But the method that I've chosen here, the inline block method with the width 100%, is one of the most reliable ones to achieve it. That works down to IE7 or something like that. Not that you even probably need to support these things, but it's just to give you a glimpse of how you achieve these layouts. And then obviously we've got Flex. Now I'm not going to talk about CSS Grid because CSS Grid is a little bit more complicated, and I want to keep this dead simple because this isn't the point of this video. So Flex is even easier to achieve. You actually only need 3 lines of CSS to achieve this. You just need to put display flex, width 70% and width 25%, or whatever the widths are on the elements that you're trying to float left or right or whatever. So Flex is really, really easy to use. But the thing that we're going to look at is pre-written grids. So you don't need to write this, and you don't need to write this either. You just use a pre-written grid. It's important for me to say at this point that those previous examples that I've shown you are perfectly valid. There's nothing wrong with using them. If you want to use those, go ahead and use them. There's nothing wrong with them. But apart from tables, by the way, that is, apart from tables, don't use tables ever again. But the other 2 methods, 3 methods are fine to use. But in the spirit of dry, don't repeat yourself. Why are we rewriting our layout CSS? And why aren't we just using something that already exists? If we want to stay efficient, and as a professional web developer or web designer, we should always be looking for efficiencies in the way that we're doing things. And if we are looking for efficiencies, we should be looking to use some code that already exists, surely. Why should we reinvent the wheel? There's lots of more intelligent people out there that have already done this thing for us. And if we've got a boilerplate, like the one that I'm going to show you, which is Learn the Web's save point, if you've already got a boilerplate, there's usually some kind of grid system already built into it, so there's kind of no reason to bother with writing it over again, and that's where our pre-written grids come in. So why should we use a pre-written grid when it takes 2 minutes to write one with Flex, for example? I think there's 5 main reasons. 1, it's proven. You don't need to bother testing it in different browsers. You know that the layout is just going to work because it exists and it's been around for a long time. I think 2, it's been written by somebody that's probably more intelligent than you. They've definitely got a lot more experience than you at building websites. So why should you bother rewriting something again? Don't reinvent the wheel. Remember, dry. Don't repeat yourself. Even though I'm repeating myself, don't repeat yourself. Use something that already exists. You don't need to bother reinventing the wheel. So use somebody else's code and then it's done. Number 3, it just works. The old Apple mantra that's kind of not really true anymore, but it just works. You don't need to bother learning the way something works. You don't need to bother rewriting something again. You don't need to bother doing it at the beginning of a project over and over and over. Just use somebody else's. Number 4, it's this efficiency word again. As professional web developers, as professional designers, we should be looking for efficiencies in every single piece of our work because it saves us time and it saves us faffing about rewriting something when it's already been written. And number 5, which is my favorite, it usually makes making a responsive website very, very easy. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So with grids, there's lots of pre-written grids out there already. It's just the way it is. It's the thing that developers like to make. They like to make pre-written grids. So there's lots of solutions out there. The most popular by far and away is Bootstrap. It's the one that you've probably heard of already. It's the one that looks a little bit like this example that I'm going to show you here. It's this one. Bootstrap already exists. It's existed for years. It's written by Twitter, or the developers behind Twitter, and you can be pretty sure that this is very, very reliable. So if you were to use this grid, you wouldn't go far wrong. To be honest, you're gonna be using the most cutting-edge methodologies. You're gonna be using something that's tested and that it's proven, and you know it's gonna work. And then there's Bourbon, and then there's Foundation. They are all both really good to use. All these ones that exist already though, the one like Bootstrap and Foundation, they usually come with a lot of other stuff. And if you only want a flexible grid, there is better solutions out there for you to check out. Just Google flexible grid and just start looking around and see which ones that might work for your project. Just go. The thing that I like to do, before I settled on what kind of grid I was going to write for Save Point, which is our boilerplate, Learn the Web's boilerplate, before I settled on how I was going to do that, I just downloaded a bunch of other ones and tried to find the most simple solution out there because I didn't want to overcomplicate it. And I found one that was really good. I kind of tweaked it a little bit and rewrote it, and then I included it in SavePoint because I didn't want to rewrite the rulebook again. Again, I wanted to create efficiencies in the thing that I was doing. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and you shouldn't be trying to reinvent the wheel either. So let's take a look at the syntax from our flexible grid, which is SavePoint. It's kind of the same as Bootstrap, really. So this is what it looks like. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, by the way, this is the same way that Bootstrap works. So in Bootstrap, you have a row, or a row, as I like to say, or a row, as people who talk properly like to say. You have a row of content, which is just a div that wraps around everything. And then you've got a col, so that is referenced by COL, and then a dash. And the dash means the amount of grid items you want it to go across. Typically, most websites are built with 12 column grids. And this grid in SavePoint and also in Bootstrap is no different. So the elements go from 1, col 2, col 3, col 4, col 5, col 6, etc., all the way through to 12. So they start at 1 and go through to 12. And the reason they do that is so you can make elements a certain amount of grid width. So for example, a col 3 would be a quarter of the page, a col 4 would be a third, etc., etc. A col 6 would be a half. So the cols just denote the amount of columns that it's going to span across. And then you'll notice in this example that I've put in here as well, I've also got a content div and a sidebar div, and they sit inside the grid. They never sit out, they never sit on the same level as the grid, because I'm going to show you a really important analogy now, and it is the shelf. So when I was first getting into grids and I had to try and teach this thing to people like you, I struggled to kind of get people's heads around this stuff. And the thing that people did the most was they used to put the classes. So they'd put the content class, for example, on the col 8. And it's important you don't do that. It's important that you keep them completely separate from each other, because it'll just, trust me on this one, this is from years of headaches and years of experience, it'll just make your life a misery if you put your classes on to the cols or the rows. So don't ever do it. So to get around that, I came up with the concept of a shelf. You consider your website as the diagram that we looked at earlier, and it's a shelf. It's a shelf that's full of content. When we bring a flexible grid into things, we've got a shelf that we can sit all our content on. And to achieve that, we're going to put all our content inside the shelf. So at the top of the page, we're going to have a row, just like I showed in the previous example. And inside that row, we're going to have some cols. And in this example here, this is the top two shelves. So inside the first col, which might be col 6 or something like that, we'd have maybe a logo div. And then inside the one next to it, we'd maybe have a nav div. So the col is, the row is the first column of the shelf. And then we'd maybe make another row, and we'd have a sidebar and a content in there, just like that. So whenever we want to put something underneath each other, because we're using a grid, and we don't want them to go next to each other, we want to go underneath, we open up another row, we close the previous one, open up another row, and it goes underneath. And then we might want to make a third row as well, and that might be the footer, and it'd have footer links and a copyright in there as well. And then we might have another row as well, and I put question marks in there because I didn't know how to explain what else you'd put at the bottom of a website, but the shelf was a good shelf to show this analogy, so yeah. So some of the shelf's rules: never put any classes or IDs on your grid, and we just spoke about that a second ago. Remember, it's a shelf for your content to sit inside of. Don't ever put classes or IDs on your actual grid. It's to be untouched. Put your elements inside of the grid. Do not ever mess with the shelf. Never mess with the grid, because it'll make your life a misery. And do not change the CSS of the grid. Just use it as it is. It's pre-written for you. So now we kind of understand the grid a little bit. When we look back at this diagram, we can kind of understand a little bit better how we might lay out a website with it. So you can see here, this is the original diagram that I showed. And then if we were to change this for using some kind of grid, the SavePoint grid, for example, it'd look a little bit like this. The header section, the first top section at the top, the blue section is opened up with a div class of row. Then inside that we might have a col3 and a col7, and then in the content we've got another row which is a col8 and a col4, and then finally in the footer we've got a col7 and a col2. So you can see how the entire website kind of breaks down to columns and rows and divs and things like that. And it makes it much easier to understand, I think, using a flexible grid, and it makes it much easier to do. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of a demo of how this works live in the SavePoint boilerplate. So there's a couple of things I want to say first. I've got my code open here, which is the SavePoint grid. I've got a web page open here, which is the actual SavePoint website. I've also got Koala running here, which is automatically generating the CSS, automatically generating the HTML and things like that. But you don't have to worry about that for this. So I've already got some content in here in this example thing, and I'm using the pre-written grid here, by the way, that's in SavePoint. The one that's in SavePoint by default is actually responsive already. So when I resize this down, you see how it's dropped down onto another line there? That's because it's already responsive, as I mentioned. So all I have to do is just pick what widths I want these elements in there. So I've got some examples in here already, and you'll see I've got a row there which ends right down here at the bottom, and then I've made a col6, so I want it to be half of the size, and then I've got my content inside of that. Remember, because we're putting our content inside the shelf, we never put it on the same level as the shelf, it goes inside the shelf. And then I've got a half there, a col6 again, and then I've got my sidebar in there, which produces that layout. If I wanted to change it, so if I wanted let's say eight columns across and, I don't know, a 4, so it looks a little bit more like the example that we've got inside the slides that I've just showed you. We do something like that, and it kind of looks a bit more like a traditional website, and that's how we achieve it, and that's how easy it is to use a pre-written grid to achieve that thing. But then also we might have some kind of footer in there too, so we might want to make another row. And by the way, I'm writing this code so quickly because of Emmet, because I've got a plugin installed in Atom called Emmet, which lets me write this stuff really quick. So I'm going to do a col6 and another col6 just to really quickly make my grid. And I've got my grid there. So this might be the footer, for example. And because it's my footer, I might want to wrap it in another div called footer, like so. And I'm just going to put that inside there so you can see how this works. And then I might have a copyright statement. Copyright, spell copyright properly, Craig. Copyright, Craig Burgess. And then, I don't know, blah. I might have something else in my footer as well. So I've put that in another row, and you'll see it's gone underneath that element there. But it's also using another row, and I could put more in there if I wanted to, if I wanted to add a third item in there. The grid just works exactly the same way like that, and then it puts two elements next to it. So the grid is super flexible like that. You just have to remember that you put something in a row and it goes along like this. You take it out of the row, it goes underneath, and then you can make another row of columns, basically. So a row is a columns. It's a row of columns, you know, like it is in Excel or whatever. So it's dead easy to use like that when you can see it like that and you can see it working, and it makes things much quicker. It makes it much quicker to write your CSS. It makes it much quicker to write your HTML, because you're not having to worry about the widths of stuff, really. All you're doing is worrying about how things work and where the widths lie. So I recommend, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, that you use some kind of boilerplate. SavePoint is a really good start. SavePoint is something you can look at. The grid is super simple inside SavePoint. In fact, I've got it here somewhere for you to look at. There it is. The grid is super simple in here. It starts there and ends there. It's about 100 lines of code. It's quite understandable, although just looking at that on the screen now, you might not have a clue what's going on there, but you can get your head around it quite easily. And it's a good example of a really simple grid to get you started. So I think you should use some kind of flexible grid in your next project, especially because it's going to have to be responsive, because just every website is responsive now. It's worth checking out flexible grids, and I hope this has explained and maybe demystified grids, the final element of responsive web design, just a little bit for you.